The raven landed on the dry branch that stretched over the bed where the lovers lay. Its black, piercing eyes seemed to judge every movement, every sigh, every betrayal. Ragnar Olafsson felt a chill run down his spine. It was not just a bird. It was Odin, the Allfather, witnessing his gravest sin. Lying with Freya, the wife of Jarl Thorvald, the man to whom he had sworn loyalty until death. Thank you so much for joining and listening to this story. Our channel is just beginning, and every subscription means the world to us. It helps keep this project alive as we strive to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. If you are enjoying the content, please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. The air was heavy with the fading chill of winter, though the sun had begun its slow climb toward the zenith, casting long, pale shadows across the dense thicket bordering Ravnfjord. The forest whispered in the gentle breeze, needles and leaves rustling like distant voices, a murmuring chorus of secrets carried through ancient pines and birch. Among those shadows moved a figure, deliberate and measured, cutting a solitary path along the edge where the trees met the frozen shoreline. Ragnar Olafsson's boots crunched softly against the frost-hardened earth. Each breath he exhaled hung in the air like smoke, mingling with the tang of damp moss and the faint, sharp scent of pine resin. The cold still bit into exposed skin, despite the promise of spring, a reminder that the northern land held no mercy for the unprepared. His breath came in steady rhythm, his senses keen to every subtle change in sound or movement, an instinct honed over years of battle and survival. At 32 winters, Ragnar bore the weight of his years not just in muscle and scars, but deep within his soul. The bronze-tinted skin of his face was marked by a jagged scar cutting through the right brow, a souvenir from a skirmish in a distant land, a tale unspoken but ever present in the steel-gray depths of his eyes. His long, dark hair, partially braided at the sides, brushed shoulders hardened by the chill and the strain of countless campaigns. Tattoos of ancient runes crept along his forearms, inked in swirling black lines that spoke of protection and war, binding him to the gods even when the path seemed lost. Yet this morning, despite the familiar armor of his body, an unfamiliar weight pressed down on his chest. It was not the burden of battle or duty he carried now, but something far more corrosive, secrets that gnawed at the edges of his honor, threats whispered in the dark corners of his mind. Ragnar was no ordinary warrior. Among the men of Ravnfjord, he was a warrior of elite status, a shield-bearer and spearhead in the Jarl Thorvald's warband. His counsel was heeded in the Thing, and his voice often rose over the crackling fires in the great hall. His cabin stood near the communal gathering place, the longhouse where feasts and judgments were held, granted to him by the Jarl himself as a mark of favor. His war-axe, its haft carved with intricate patterns depicting the Midgard serpent and Valkyries, was always within reach. But none of these honors could shield Ragnar from the turmoil within. The dawn found him restless, pacing the rocky edge of the forest, his mind caught in a storm of longing and dread. The land stretched out before him, fjords carved by ancient glaciers, dark waters shimmering under the weak sunlight, the scent of salt and seaweed rising from the shore. The horizon was a jagged line of snow-capped peaks, their pale faces watching silently over the scattered dwellings of the settlement. Smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys, weaving through the branches like the spirits of ancestors. It was a place of rugged beauty and hard lives, where survival depended on strength, cunning, and a tenuous respect for the gods. Ragnar paused, closing his eyes to the sounds around him. The distant call of a gull, the crack of a branch beneath a deer's cautious step, the faint creak of wooden boats moored in the harbor. The smell of burning firewood drifted from the village, mingling with the crisp air that still carried the sharp bite of winter's departure. But beneath the surface of this familiar world, tension pulsed like the steady beat of a war drum. He remembered how, only a season past, the days had been darker and colder, the village huddled beneath heavy blankets of snow. It was then that fate had twisted its cruel hand, that quiet moments shared in the shadow of the forest had ignited a fire that now threatened to consume everything. Ragnar's thoughts turned involuntarily to Freya Gunnarsdottir. Even the thought of her name sent a shiver through him, a mixture of desire and dread. Her golden hair, bright as summer sun, had haunted his dreams long before their paths crossed. The way her emerald eyes held a secret sorrow, a strength beneath the delicate beauty, had drawn him in like a moth to flame. But she wasn't just any woman. Freya was the wife of the Jarl Thorvald, a woman cloaked in power and pride. To touch her was to risk everything, his honor, his life, and the fragile peace of Ravenfjord. Yet in the cold silence of the wilderness, far from watchful eyes, their meetings had become a refuge, a stolen warmth in a world often cruel and unforgiving. That morning, as Ragnar adjusted the leather sheath on his belt and felt the reassuring weight of his hunting knife, a presence interrupted his solitude. Halvor Sigurdsson emerged from the shadows of the trees, his broad shoulders wrapped in a worn brown tunic, the fur collar of his cloak bristling against the chill. Halvor was more than a comrade. He was Ragnar's brother in all but blood, battle-hardened and fiercely loyal. His sun-kissed hair was cut short, framing a face marked with the rough edges of years spent in skirmishes, including a missing piece of his left ear, the result of a blade's cruel bite. "The corvids fly restless today," Halvor said, his voice low yet steady. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the sky where 3 black birds circled above, their silhouettes stark against the pale blue. Ragnar followed his gaze. The ravens, sacred to Odin, moved with unnatural purpose, their wings cutting silent arcs through the cold air. In Norse belief, such signs were never to be ignored. "Thorvald calls a thing," Halvor continued, stepping closer. "He's returned early from the Eastports, brings news and gifts." Ragnar's stomach clenched with unease. The Jarl should not have returned for another moon cycle. The early arrival carried with it the weight of ill tidings. "When?" Ragnar asked, voice tight. "Before nightfall," Halvor answered, his gaze flickering toward the settlement. "Slaves, goods from distant shores, and a captured spy, one of Haakon's." The mention of Haakon Barbagris, the ruthless leader of the rival clan, stirred a bitter anger in Ragnar. For years, Haakon's ambition had threatened the fragile balance of power in the region. His raids were brutal, his desire to claim Ravenfjord's fertile lands unrelenting. Ragnar's fists clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening beneath the worn leather gloves. The very name was a summons to battle, a reminder of promises made in blood and fire. They both turned toward the village, which lay nestled between the dense forest and the icy fjord, smoke rising in lazy spirals from thatched roofs. The scent of earth, wood, and salt mingled in the cold air, grounding Ragnar despite the storm raging within. From a distance, the figure of Freya moved gracefully among the villagers, coordinating preparations for the Jarl's return. Her posture was regal, every movement deliberate, as if the very ground acknowledged her status. Her golden hair gleamed in the early sun, braided with threads of silver and adorned with small amber beads. The blue cloak she wore billowed softly in the breeze, the fine linen of her dress catching the light. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, a silent exchange weighted with unspoken fears and desires.
That brief connection spoke volumes, the shared knowledge of forbidden nights, the danger lurking beneath their stolen kisses. The risk was all-consuming, like walking a knife's edge over an abyss. Ragnar's mind drifted back to the first time their worlds collided. It had been during Thorvald's absence on a long trading voyage, a season marked by icy winds and shortened days. Freya's visits to the forest's edge were initially innocent, seeking herbs and remedies for the village. But as days bled into nights, their conversations deepened. Secrets and confessions spilled as freely as the mead at feast.
One night, beneath a canopy of stars sharp and cold, they had surrendered to the fragile warmth between them. In the small cabin of herbs, hidden from the prying eyes of the settlement, their bodies entwined in a union that shattered every oath. Ragnar knew the weight of his betrayal. It was not merely the breaking of a vow to Thorvald, but a fracture in the very fabric of his identity as a warrior sworn to loyalty and honor. Yet, once tasted, there was no turning back. The hours passed, and the village came alive with the hum of anticipation. The tide of humanity shifted as warriors readied their weapons, merchants secured their wares, and families whispered prayers to the gods for safe returns. When the long ships appeared on the horizon, their dragon prows cutting through the mist, a hush fell over the crowd gathered on the shore. Thorvald, the Jarl of Ravnfjord, strode on to the pebbled beach with the weight of the world in his eyes. His red hair, streaked with gray, was tied back with leather thongs, beard braided tightly at the ends. The scars etched on his face spoke of battles survived and enemies crushed. In his hand he carried a new sword, its blade gleaming cold and sharp, its hilt adorned with precious stones and gold filigree, a symbol of power and conquest. Behind him followed a train of warriors, merchants, and bound prisoners, captives from distant raids, their chains clinking softly against the stones. Ragnar stood among the honored men of the Jarl's guard, positioned at his right as tradition demanded. The great hall awaited, its timbered walls echoing with the promise of feasts and judgments to come. From across the gathering, his eyes searched for Freya. She was there, beside her husband, radiant and composed, yet the tension in her shoulders betrayed the weight she carried. As Thorvald embraced her, his lips pressing possessively against hers, Ragnar felt the cold bite of jealousy twist sharp within him. The moment was public, a display of dominance and possession. Yet beneath it lay a fracture none dared acknowledge. He forced himself to remain stoic, the mask of the seasoned warrior concealing the turmoil beneath. Inside the hall, the air was thick with the scent of burning pine and roasted meat. Torches flickered against the wooden walls, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. The Jarl's voice rang out, recounting tales of distant lands and daring raids, his words woven with pride and threat. The gleam of treasure and the rattle of coins punctuated his speech, a reminder of the wealth that fueled their survival. But the festivities were interrupted when a chained figure was dragged to the center of the room. Blood stained his ragged clothing, his head bowed beneath the weight of accusation. This man, Thorvald thundered, voice echoing beneath the high beams, was caught stealing our navigation maps. He confessed to serving Haakon Barbagris. The hall fell into murmurs, a wave of unease sweeping through the crowd. Ragnar studied the prisoner, a youth barely hardened by battle, eyes wide with fear and defiance. Perhaps a son sent to prove himself in shadows and deception. Haakon plans to take Ravnfjord, Thorvald declared, his gaze sweeping the assembly. Not merely to raid, but to claim it as his own. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the knowledge of looming war. "Then we shall strike first," the Jarl proclaimed. "When the new moon rises in 3 days, Ragnar Olafsson will lead the right flank." A burden heavier than any armor settled on Ragnar's shoulders. The command was clear, the path set in blood and fire. That night, beneath a sky flecked with stars cold as steel, the longhouse hummed with the dim haze of mead and whispered schemes. Voices grew louder, laughter more hollow, yet beneath the revelry lurked the pulse of dread. When the feast waned and the hall emptied, a delicate hand brushed against Ragnar's sleeve. The soft voice of one of Freya's servants trembled as a small woven cloth was pressed into his palm. The runes embroidered in red thread spoke in silent code. The place and time of a meeting he could neither refuse nor ignore. Ragnar's heart hammered in a wild rhythm as he slipped from his quarters, the moonlight guiding his steps through the sleeping village. The night air was crisp, each breath a shard of ice in his lungs. The forest loomed, a dark fortress of shadows and secrets. At the edge of the trees stood the small cabin where Freya tended her herbs, a sanctuary and a cage. Inside, her eyes shone with tears of fear and longing. "He knows," she whispered, voice breaking the fragile calm. "Thorvald suspects. He questioned others. About you. About us." Ragnar's blood ran cold. The Jarl's wrath was legendary, swift and merciless. "We must end this," he said, the words thick with sorrow, "before it consumes us both." But Freya stepped closer, her fingers trembling as they traced the lines of his face. "It's too late. If he punishes me, it will be for both our sins. And if we are to die, then let us face it together." Their lips met, a desperate tether against the storm closing in. Through the small window, the silhouette of a raven appeared, perched on a bare branch, its black eyes unblinking and silent. The bird's presence was a grim reminder that the gods watched, their judgment inescapable. When dawn broke, Ragnar left before the village stirred, the weight of choice heavy in his heart. The day ahead held no promise but the certainty of reckoning. As he returned to his cabin, the door was thrown open abruptly. Halvor stood there, pale and urgent. "Thorvald demands your presence, now." Ragnar's hand instinctively went to his axe, but Halvor's grip stopped him. "No weapons. The jar commands you be disarmed." The path to the great hall was a gauntlet of stairs, some curious, others cold with suspicion. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they opened, revealing Thorvald seated upon his throne, eyes burning with hard resolve. Beside him stood Freya, her face streaked with tears, but unbowed. "Ragnar Olafsson," the Jarl's voice cut through the silence. "You know why you are here." Ragnar met the gaze of the man who had once been his leader and friend, the weight of betrayal pressing down like iron chains. Thorvald's smile was thin, a blade disguised as kindness. "Your courage has been known to me, your loyalty once unquestioned, but it seems even that has limits." He rose, closing the distance between them, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "You took what was mine. You dishonored my house and name." Ragnar stood silent, accepting the condemnation with what dignity remained. "You should die here, now, your head on a spike for all to see. But the gods have granted me a crueler mercy." The Jarl's eyes gleamed with dark intent. "You will lead the attack on Haakon's camp, alone, without weapons from Ravenfjord, to kill him in his own bed. A sentence both death and exile. And if I refuse, Thorvald's gaze shifted to Freya, her trembling form a silent threat. Then she will pay for both our sins, slowly. The choice was a chain without links, binding Ragnar to a fate he neither wanted nor could avoid. He bowed his head, the cold acceptance settling like a stone in his gut. That night, stripped of his war honors, armed only with a plain sword and small shield, Ragnar slipped into the dark woods. The solitude was suffocating, but within it burned a spark of resolve. He would not walk blindly into death. The journey to Haakon's camp was a test of patience and cunning. For a day he traversed wild lands, avoiding trails and watchful eyes, moving like a shadow beneath the canopy. The world was quiet, save for the whisper of leaves and the distant cry of wolves. As the sun began its descent, he finally glimpsed the rough palisades of the enemy stronghold, its guards pacing the walls like restless sentinels. He studied their patterns, the changing of shifts, the weak points in their defenses. When the moon reached its zenith, casting pale silver over the earth, Ragnar emerged from the shadows and approached the main gate openly, hands empty, sword sheathed. "I bear a message for Haakon Barbagris," he declared to the startled guards, "from one who knows Thorvald's plans." His boldness unsettled them, but the weight of his presence and certainty could not be ignored. He was led through the gates, eyes wary, to stand before the man who had long haunted the edges of his life. Haakon was a giant of a man, fierce and unyielding. His black beard flowed over his dark tunic, his face a map of scars and hardened resolve. Yet his eyes betrayed a sharp intelligence, a ruler who measured every word and deed with ruthless calculation. "A warrior of Thorvald walks into my camp willingly," Haakon said, "or a fool." "Neither," Ragnar answered evenly. "I am a man who sees the game for what it is, and will not be used as a pawn to die meaningless." He revealed the truth, Thorvald's plans, the mission meant to ensure his death, and the tangled web of betrayal. He spoke not to save himself, but because the truth was a weapon he wielded with cold precision. Haakon listened, weighing each word, then asked, "Why should I trust a traitor?" "Because I come unarmed, because I offer my knowledge freely, with no promise of return, because I seek only survival and a place where my past does not define me." After counsel with his trusted men, Haakon made his verdict. Ragnar would be watched, but his information would serve the clan. If true, he would earn his place. When the battle came, swift as the winter storm, the warriors of Thorvald met not vulnerability, but a trap forged in fire and steel. Amid the chaos, Thorvald searched desperately for the man who had been his shield and blade. In the clash of sword and axe, eyes locked in fury and betrayal, the two men faced what once was brotherhood, now sundered. When Ragnar's axe shattered Thorvald's shield and bit into his shoulder, the Jarl fell, defeated but alive. Ragnar did not strike the killing blow. "I will not take your life," he said quietly, "but I will take your honor, as you tried to take mine." The war ended with surrender, and in the ashes of betrayal, new paths were forged. Haakon welcomed Ragnar into his fold, the warrior reborn among former enemies. Though the chance to return home was offered, Ragnar refused. Some betrayals could never be undone. As the sun rose over the horizon of a new dawn, a solitary raven watched from a nearby branch. This time, its gaze held not judgment, but something else, perhaps forgiveness, or a quiet promise of guidance through the shadows that lie ahead.
The night had settled into a cold, restless silence when Ragnar found himself moving cautiously through the dense underbrush near the outskirts of Haakon's stronghold. The moon hung low, a pale sliver barely cutting through the thick canopy of ancient pines, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe with every breath of the wind. His footsteps were measured, careful. Each snap of twig or rustle of leaves sharpened his senses, reminding him that here, in the heart of enemy lands, the price of a mistake was death. Ragnar's mind churned with the weight of the mission ahead, the impossible task Thorvald had imposed upon him. To assassinate Haakon Barbagris in his own bed, unarmed by his own clan's standards, was to walk willingly into the jaws of Helhelm. But the man who once bore the Jarl's standard now carried only the bitter taste of betrayal to fuel his resolve. As he skirted a shallow ravine, the faint sound of muffled breathing caught his attention, a soft, uneven rhythm like a whisper against the stillness. He froze, instinct sharpening to a blade's edge, scanning the shadows for the source.
The forest around him held its breath. From behind a fallen log, barely visible beneath the tangled roots and dead leaves, emerged a figure. A young woman, her clothes tattered and stained with dirt and blood, her face pale and bruised. Her breathing was shallow, eyes wide and haunted, reflecting the scant moonlight like twin pools of fear. Ragnar's heart tightened. She was but a child, no older than 17 summers, perhaps younger. Her blonde hair clung in wet strands to her face, lips cracked and trembling, and her slender frame shook beneath the weight of exhaustion and terror. Without a word, she reached out, her hands trembling as she grasped at the hem of his cloak. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. The suddenness of the plea sent a jolt through Ragnar's chest. Every instinct screamed for caution. The enemy's spies and scouts were known to prowl these woods, setting traps for any who strayed too close. To aid a stranger here was to risk exposure, to invite betrayal. And yet the desperation in her eyes stirred something long buried beneath the scars and hardened resolve. He knelt slowly, lowering himself to her level, careful not to frighten her further. "Who are you?" His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of command, yet tempered with an unexpected gentleness. "My name is Ingrid," she breathed. "I was taken from my home in the village near the North Fjord. Haakon's men raided it last moon. They killed my family. I escaped, but I'm lost. I don't know where to go." Ragnar's gaze softened, despite the shadows in the forest. The cruelty of this world was etched into every line of her face. He could feel the raw edge of her grief, the kind that threatened to swallow hope whole. "You should not be here," he said, though his tone betrayed no judgment, only concern. "It is dangerous. You could be caught, or worse." Ingrid nodded, swallowing hard. "I have nowhere else. The Jarl's camp is no refuge, but it's all I have left." Ragnar's mind raced. To turn her away would be to condemn her to the merciless wilderness, or worse, recapture by Haakon's men. And yet, to protect her risked his own mission, the fragile trust he had begun to forge with the enemy. For a long moment, the forest seemed to close in around them, the weight of silence pressing on Ragnar's shoulders. The distant howls of wolves echoed like ghosts in the night, a reminder that mercy in these lands was a rare and costly thing. "Come," he finally said, reaching out to help her to her feet. "I will keep you hidden, but you must be silent. Your life depends on it." Ingrid's eyes glistened with a fragile hope as she clung to him, leaning heavily on the strength of a man's path was shadowed by death. There was no joy in this rescue,
only the grim understanding that trust was a dangerous gamble. Yet, for a moment, the cold edges of the night softened under the weight of shared vulnerability. As they moved deeper into the forest, Ragnar felt the familiar weight of a warrior's armor settle around him once more. Not the iron and leather of battle, but the invisible shield of responsibility. The price of betrayal was steep, but the price of turning away innocence was a burden he could no longer bear. Hours later, hidden beneath a thick thicket of spruce and ash, Ragnar fashioned a crude shelter from branches and leaves. He offered Ingrid what little food he carried, a few dried fish and hard bread, and watched as she ate in small, desperate bites. Her trembling hands pushed the scraps forward, cheeks hollow from hunger and fear. Ragnar's own hunger was forgotten, his thoughts tangled in the fragile thread of life he had chosen to protect, a thread that might unravel both their fates. "Why help me?" Ingrid finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ragnar's gaze drifted toward the dark horizon, where the first faint hints of dawn began to bleed into the sky. "Because sometimes the gods watch not for the brave warriors or the mighty jarls, but for those who have no voice. And because I cannot abandon what little good remains in this world." The words hung in the frosty air, heavy with unspoken truths. Ragnar was no longer just a soldier in a political game. He was a man grappling with the fractured remnants of his honor, seeking redemption in the face of despair. But even as the fragile ember of hope kindled between them, the shadow of Thorvald's command loomed over Ragnar's conscience, a reminder that this act of mercy might yet cost him everything. Ingrid's presence was a beacon in the darkness, but also a tether to the world he was desperately trying to escape. To protect her was to invite scrutiny, suspicion, and danger. Yet to abandon her was a sin he could not abide. That night, as the wind whispered ancient laments through the trees, Ragnar settled beside the makeshift shelter. His thoughts wandered to Freya, the woman who had ignited this chain of events, whose love had doomed and saved him in equal measure. The weight of his choices pressed down, but beneath it all, a quiet resolve took root. Whatever path lay ahead, it would be walked not alone. As the first light of dawn crept through the branches, Ragnar rose silently, casting one last glance toward the sleeping form of the girl he had sworn to protect. The forest held its breath once more, the raven's call echoing faintly in the distance, a reminder that the gods were watching still. And Ragnar Olafsson would answer their watchful eyes not with silence, but with defiance. The forest around them softened with the early light of dawn, the sharp edges of night folding into the muted hues of morning. Ragnar moved carefully through the tangled underbrush, his breath steady despite the cold that still clung to the earth. Beside him, Ingrid clung to his side, fragile as a sapling swaying in a cold wind, but her grip held firm, an anchor in the midst of uncertainty. That night, as the wind whispered ancient laments through the trees, Ragnar settled beside the makeshift shelter. His thoughts wandered to Freya, the woman who had ignited this chain of events, whose love had doomed and saved him in equal measure. The weight of his choices pressed down, but beneath it all, a quiet resolve took root. Whatever path lay ahead, it would be walked not alone. As the first light of dawn crept through the branches, Ragnar rose silently, casting one last glance toward the sleeping form of the girl he had sworn to protect. The forest held its breath once more, the raven's call echoing faintly in the distance, a reminder that the gods were watching still. And Ragnar Olafsson would answer their watchful eyes not with silence, but with defiance.
The weight of her small frame against his side was both a burden and a balm. Each step deeper into the wilderness was a step further from the world he once knew, and yet here, in the stillness between the towering pines, a fragile bond began to take shape,
unspoken and tentative, yet undeniable. Ragnar had chosen a place few dared to approach, a small clearing hidden beneath the shelter of ancient oaks where a forgotten cabin rested. It was a relic of past seasons, abandoned when the last occupant had succumbed to the relentless march of time and hardship. Moss crawled over its timber walls, and the thatched roof sagged under years of snow and rain. The smoke hole gaped like a silent wound, but to Ragnar it was sanctuary. The journey had been long, but the promise of shelter, even one so battered, breathed renewed strength into his limbs. He knelt by the cabin's threshold, running a hand over the weathered wood, feeling the rough grain beneath calloused fingers. Then, turning to Ingrid, he offered a small, steady smile. "We are safe here," he said softly, his voice low, careful not to shatter the fragile peace. She nodded, her pale face flushed with cold and exhaustion. Her eyes, wide and wary, flickered with a flicker of relief, a fragile ember against the chill. She took tentative steps forward, each one weighed down by uncertainty, but guided by trust. Inside, the cabin was dark and cramped, the smell of damp earth and rotting wood thick in the air. Ragnar lit a small fire in the stone hearth, coaxing flickers of warmth to life. The crackle of flame was a balm to the raw cold that clung to their bones. He watched as Ingrid lowered herself onto a worn straw-stuffed bench, her limbs trembling from fatigue and hunger. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything words could not capture. The shared awareness of peril, the tentative hope that survival was still possible. From a worn satchel slung across his shoulder, Ragnar withdrew a small bundle of dried fish and flatbread, unwrapping it slowly and setting the meager feast before her. Ingrid's hands shook as she reached out, fingers brushing against his briefly, a touch so fleeting it might have been imagined. She ate quietly, the rhythm uneven and hesitant. Each bite seemed to soak in more than just sustenance. It was a reclaiming of life, a small defiance against the cruelty that had chased her into the woods. Ragnar sat beside her, the weight of his own hunger forgotten. His gaze found hers, green eyes clouded with shadows that did not yet yield to the light. In that gaze he saw a story unspoken, a life shattered but not extinguished. There was a faint scar tracing the delicate curve of her jaw, almost hidden by the strands of golden hair that escaped in wild tangles. It was a mark of past violence, perhaps a blow caught in flight, or a reminder of captivity. He recognized the language of pain, though he dared not ask.
Instead, he reached for a cloth tucked among his belongings, a strip of linen softened by time, and gently dampened it in the warm ashes of the fire. With careful, practiced hands, he tended to the bruises darkening Ingrid's pale skin, wiping away the dirt and dried blood with a tenderness that belied his warrior's exterior. She flinched at the touch, but did not pull away. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but the words caught on the edge of a breath. Instead, she let her fingers trace the lines of his forearm, the intricate runes tattooed there, curling like whispered prayers. Ragnar's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You carry the weight of many winters," he said, watching her reaction closely. "But you are still here." Ingrid's eyes shimmered with tears held back by sheer will. "I have no one left," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "No family, no home, just the cold." His heart tightened. The harsh world they inhabited left little room for mercy or softness. Yet here, in this fragile moment, something unspoken passed between them, a silent vow to protect, to endure.
Ragnar stood, stretching muscles stiff from travel. He stripped off his wolfskin cloak and draped it over her shoulders. The thick fur, a promise of warmth and shelter. The scent of pine and smoke clung to it, a reminder of the wild lands they both now called home. Outside, a cold wind stirred, rattling the skeletal branches of the trees. The sky was a pale wash of gray, the promise of rain hanging heavy. Yet within the cabin the fire flickered steady, casting long shadows that danced like ancient spirits on the walls. As night crept in, Ragnar fashioned a crude bed from straw and blankets salvaged from an old trunk. He gestured for Ingrid to rest, her body weary beyond measure. She hesitated, then allowed herself to sink into the softness, eyes closing briefly in a rare moment of peace. He sat on the floor nearby, his gaze drifting to the small window, where the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. His thoughts returned inexorably to Freya, the woman whose love had ignited this chain of ruin and salvation. The cabin was quiet, but for the crackling fire and the soft, even breathing of the girl before him. Words were unnecessary. The bond forged in silence ran deeper than any spoken vow. To protect Ingrid now was to face the uncertain tides of fate, to walk a path fraught with peril, but also, perhaps, with redemption. Ragnar felt the weight of the raven's gaze lingering in his mind, a reminder that the gods watched still. This act of mercy, fragile and dangerous, might yet alter the course of his destiny. For now he would be the shield in the shadows, the silent guardian of a lost soul. Tomorrow the world would come again with its harsh demands. But tonight, in this battered cabin beneath ancient trees, two broken lives found a fragile shelter from the storm. The forest around the cabin had begun to change with the passing days.
The sharp edges of winter's chill softened into a tentative warmth, the snow melting into patches of damp earth and fresh shoots pushing through the soil. Yet the fragile peace that had settled over Ragnar and Ingrid was anything but assured. Whispers traveled faster than the thaw, carried on the wind like dark omens, and the world beyond the trees was beginning to close in on their precarious refuge. It started with the curious eyes of neighbors who noticed the absence of Ingrid from her village. The North Fjord settlement was a tight-knit community where every face was known, and the disappearance of a young woman without a trace was not easily overlooked. Questions began to form in hushed conversations around fire pits and within the walls of longhouses, carried by worried elders and restless warriors alike. Ragnar felt the first tremors of suspicion when Halvor arrived unexpectedly near their hiding place. The warrior's usual confidence was shadowed by unease, his expression guarded as he lowered his heavy cloak against the spring breeze. "We cannot hide forever," Halvor said quietly, his gaze flickering between the darkened woods and the worn path leading from the village. "The talk is spreading. They speak of a missing girl, of strange movements near the border. Some even whisper of spies in the forest." Ragnar's jaw tightened. The delicate balance he had tried to maintain was crumbling. Protecting Ingrid was no longer just a matter of personal conviction. It had become a burden that threatened to endanger them both. "They will come," Ragnar answered, voice low but steady, "and we must be ready." Halvor nodded grimly. "I will stand with you, but the others, they may be less forgiving. The Jarl's men grow restless, and not all will see your actions as mercy." That night, beneath a sky thick with heavy clouds, Ragnar and Ingrid sat by the flickering fire inside the cabin, their faces etched with tension. Ingrid's pale features were fragile, the shadows beneath her eyes deepening with each passing hour. She clutched the wolfskin cloak tightly, seeking comfort in its warmth.
"Why do they hunt us?" she whispered, voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Ragnar looked into the fire, the orange tongues reflecting in his steely eyes. "Because fear breeds suspicion, because in times of war, kindness is often mistaken for betrayal." Her fingers trembled as she reached for his hand, the touch fragile but desperate. "Do you think they will find us?" He hesitated, the weight of unspoken fears pressing against his throat. "They will try, but until then we fight the shadow that seeks to claim us." The days that followed brought more signs of the tightening noose. Tracks appeared near the cabin, soft impressions in the mud where boots had pressed and broken twigs. The crack of distant voices echoed through the trees, sharp and accusing. Every rustle of leaves became a potential threat, every flicker of movement a warning.
One afternoon, as the sun fought weakly to pierce the gray sky, Ragnar spotted a small band of men moving cautiously along the ridge overlooking the clearing. Their weapons were crude but effective, spears, axes, and bows resting lightly in their hands. Their eyes scanned the forest with suspicion, their war-paint streaked faces hard with determination. Ragnar silently gestured to Ingrid, pulling her back into the deeper shadows where the thick brush swallowed them whole. He moved with the ease of a hunter, every muscle coiled and ready, heart pounding beneath the wolf-skin cloak. "They are scouts," he murmured, "sent to find us." Ingrid's breath hitched, her body pressed close against his. "Will they kill us if they find us?" The question hung in the cold air, heavier than any blade. Ragnar's eyes darkened. "Some may. Others will bring more danger." The scouts lingered, their voices low and cautious as they moved through the undergrowth. Ragnar's mind raced. To fight openly was suicide. To stay hidden meant a slow, suffocating siege. And yet surrender was not an option, not while Ingrid's life hung in the balance. That night, in the dim glow of the cabin, Ragnar laid out a plan. "We cannot remain here," he said. "The forest will no longer shield us. We must move deeper, where the land grows harsh and few dare tread." Ingrid swallowed hard, the tremor in her hands betraying the fear beneath her resilience. "Where will we go?" "Far to the north," Ragnar answered, "beyond the frozen lakes, into the mountains where only the brave or the desperate survive." She nodded, the resolve in her eyes kindling a spark of hope. "I will follow you anywhere." The preparation was swift and silent. Together they gathered what little supplies remained: dried meat, water skins, a few scraps of cloth. Ragnar sharpened his plain sword with careful strokes, the steel catching the flicker of firelight. Ingrid wrapped herself tightly in the wolfskin cloak, and together they stepped out into the night, leaving the cabin and the safety it once promised behind. The journey northward was a test of endurance and will. The forest grew denser, the skies darker, the air colder. Branches clawed at their faces, and the uneven ground threatened to send them tumbling into hidden chasms. Sometimes the silence was shattered by the distant howl of wolves, a reminder of the wilderness that ruled these lands. At other times, the rustle of leaves betrayed the approach of unknown watchers. Ragnar kept Ingrid close, his body a shield against the biting cold and the unseen dangers lurking beyond each bend. His mind never rested, weaving strategies and contingencies, weighing their chances in a world that showed little mercy. Several times they caught glimpses of figures in the distance, men on horseback or foot, their passage leaving fleeting impressions in the snow and mud. Rings of smoke from distant fires marked the borders of rival clans, each wary and watchful of strangers who might bring war or death. Yet amid the tension, small moments of fragile humanity shone through. One evening, as they paused beside a frozen stream to drink, Ingrid's hand brushed against Ragnar's, an unspoken question passing between them. The cold bit at their fingers, but the warmth of their touch was a small defiance against the harshness of the world. "Do you think the gods watch us still?" she asked softly, her breath misting in the air. Ragnar's gaze lifted to the pale moon hanging low above the treetops. Odin's ravens fly over all, watching, judging, sometimes guiding. The memory of the black corvo that had once perched silently outside the cabin returned with sharp clarity. It had been a witness to their sins and secrets, a silent sentinel whose gaze felt heavier than any sword. "Perhaps," Ragnar continued, "they see more than we do, and in their silence they offer a chance for redemption." As they pressed onward, the weight of the past clung to Ragnar like a shadow. The betrayal, the forbidden love, the mission that had become a death sentence, all were threads woven into the tapestry of his fate. But beside him walked a symbol of hope and survival, a living reminder that even in the darkest times, the bonds forged in trust could withstand the harshest storms. Days blurred into nights as they traveled through the wilderness, the air growing thinner and the terrain more unforgiving. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, fatigue threatened to drag them into despair, but the will to survive burned fiercely. One morning, as the first light of dawn bled weakly over the horizon, they found themselves at the edge of a narrow mountain pass. Jagged rocks loomed on either side, their peaks lost in swirling mists. The path was treacherous and steep, but it offered the promise of seclusion and sanctuary from those who sought to hunt them down. Ragnar paused, his breath coming in ragged pulls, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. Ingrid stood close, every muscle tense with anticipation and fear. "This path will test us," he said, voice rough but resolute. "But it is our best chance." Together they stepped into the pass, the silence around them deepening with the rising sun. The world felt vast and indifferent, yet in that moment, within the narrow corridor of stone and sky, Ragnar found a strange clarity. The gods watched, the ravens waited, and he would meet whatever fate lay ahead. Not as a broken warrior haunted by betrayal, but as a man who chose to protect what little light remained in a world darkened by war. But even as they pressed deeper into the mountains, the inevitable truth lingered. Rumors of their flight had already spread, reaching ears both hostile and curious. The shadow of Thorvald's wrath was long, and the price of defiance steep. The forces closing in were not just the men who hunted with weapons raised, but the relentless weight of a world where loyalty was currency, and betrayal was a debt paid in blood. And so the chase continued, silent, relentless, and unforgiving. The first light of a cold dawn barely filtered through the thick canopy, casting a muted gray over the battered cabin nestled deep within the mountain forest. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, thick enough to choke on, laden with the unspoken fears and relentless uncertainty that clung to every shadowed corner. The war outside was no longer distant thunder. It had drawn near, relentless and merciless, like the frost creeping through the cracks in the worn wooden walls. Ragnar stirred from his restless sleep, muscles aching from days of travel and nights spent on frigid earth. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dimness, and immediately found Ingrid's pale, weary face. She lay on the straw bed, her breath shallow but steady, a fragile thread holding her to this world.
His heart clenched. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him more fiercely than any armor ever had. Outside, the faint crunch of footsteps on hardened earth tore through the silence. Instinct snapped him to his feet. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the slats. Shapes emerged from the mist, figures clad in dark leathers and worn furs, weapons glinting dully in the weak dawn. Not scouts, warriors. The hunters had found them. Ragnar's mind raced. There was no time for careful planning now. The fragile sanctuary would soon be overrun. Yet even as fear prickled his skin, a grim determination settled in his chest. He would face this storm, whatever the cost. He turned, rousing Ingrid gently. "They're coming," he said quietly, voice heavy with the burden of inevitability. "We cannot hide any longer. We must prepare." Her eyes opened, wide with terror but resolute. "What will we do?" He met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "We fight, or we die, but we do not surrender." Together they moved through the cramped cabin, gathering what little weapons and provisions remained. Ragnar's plain sword and small shield felt pitiful against the thought of an armed band descending upon them, but they would have to suffice. There was no room for doubt. Outside, the first warriors approached the cabin, their voices low and harsh as they formed a rough circle, weapons drawn. At their lead was a figure unmistakable even in the haze, a man whose presence alone radiated cold authority and unyielding will. Thorvald Haakonsson, the Jarl of Ravnfjord, the man whose wrath now bore down upon Ragnar like a blade. Thorvald's eyes burned with a fury that had not dimmed in the months since Ragnar's betrayal. His red hair, streaked with gray, caught the rising light as he stepped forward, the heavy cloak of a Jarl trailing behind him like a shadow of doom.
Every sinew of his body spoke of battle-hardened power, every scar a testament to the blood shed under his command. "Ragnar Olafsson," Thorvald's voice rang out, cutting through the morning mist like a hammer on steel. "You stand accused of treason, of betrayal, of sowing discord in the heart of Ravnfjord." Ragnar stepped from the cabin's shelter, sword in hand, shield raised, not in submission, but in defiance. The cold air bit into his skin, but he stood tall, the years of war etched into his posture. "I do not deny what I have done," Ragnar said, voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "But I will not cower before a man who would send me to die as a pawn in a game of power." Thorvald's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You were my shield, my trusted warrior, yet you chose to strike at my back when I was most vulnerable. You brought Haakon Barbagris into my very home." "Haakon offered me life when you offered only death," Ragnar replied, his gaze unflinching, "and I chose to survive." A murmur rippled through the circle of warriors surrounding them, some eyes wary, others burning with judgment. Thorvald's expression hardened. "You will answer for your crimes, Ragnar, not by sword alone, but by the law of our people. You will stand trial before the thing, and the verdict will be your end." Ragnar's jaw tightened, but he bowed his head, the weight of fate settling over him like a shroud. The thing, the ancient assembly where justice was dispensed in the light of community and tradition, was both a chance and a sentence. A chance to speak, to plead, to perhaps find mercy. A sentence because the verdict of betrayal was often swift and merciless. As the men moved to bind him, Ingrid stepped forward, her voice clear despite the trembling in her limbs.
"I stand with him," she declared, eyes locked on Thorvald. "We faced the wilderness together. We have survived your wrath. This man is no traitor. He is a man who chose his path, even when it meant facing death." A hush fell. Such words from the Jarl's wife carried weight, yet also danger. Thorvald's eyes narrowed, flickering toward Freya, who had remained silent, her presence a shadow beside her husband. "Your loyalty now is as suspect as his," Thorvald spat, voice dripping with venom. "A traitor's companion bears the same stain." Freya's gaze was unreadable, but within its depths flickered a fierce defiance. "I know the truth," she said, quietly but firmly, "and it is not as simple as you would have them believe." Thorvald's grip tightened on his sword hilt. The fragile balance threatened to shatter. The warriors drew tighter, weapons raised. The threat was clear. No mercy awaited on either side. Ragnar stepped between them, raising his sword in a silent command to hold. "Let us go to the thing. Let the people judge." Thorvald hesitated, then nodded curtly. "So be it. But know this. Should you be found guilty, your life ends where it began, on the field of battle."
The procession toward the thing was somber, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Word of Ragnar's capture and the impending trial had spread like wildfire through the settlement, drawing a crowd that swelled as they approached the ancient clearing where the thing was held. The ground was scarred by centuries of judgments, a place where clans met to unveil truths and dispense justice. Ragnar walked with measured steps, shield strapped to his back, sword sheathed but close. Ingrid followed silently, a pillar of fragile strength beside him. The faces in the crowd were a mosaic of suspicion, condemnation, and curiosity. Friends and foes alike wrestling with the turmoil of betrayal. At the center of the clearing stood the Jarl's seat, a carved wooden throne raised on a dais above the assembly. Thorvald ascended, his presence commanding the silence that fell like a heavy cloak. Ragnar faced the assembly, his voice rising clear and unwavering despite the weight pressing down upon him. "I stand before you not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as one who seeks truth. I loved this land and the people in it. But I am also a man who has made choices, hard choices, to survive, to protect those who could not protect themselves." He paused, scanning the faces etched with skepticism. "My loyalty was to the clans, to the people, not to a man who saw me as a disposable tool. When I was sent to die, I chose life, and in doing so, I fought to save what could be saved." A murmur rose, some voices questioning, others nodding in reluctant respect. Thorvald's voice cut through, sharp as a blade. "You speak of survival, yet you betrayed your oath. You betrayed me, and for that you must pay." Freya stepped forward, the fire of her conviction igniting the cold assembly. Ragnar's betrayal was not born of malice, but of desperation. The man you condemned is more than the sum of his sins. The crowd shifted uneasily. The tension was palpable. The assembly held its collective breath. Then the eldest among them, a gray-haired chieftain with eyes like chipped flint, rose. "The law is clear. Betrayal is death. But the gods also demand justice tempered with wisdom. Let the verdict be decided not by anger, but by the worth of a man's deeds." One by one, voices rose in debate, weaving a tapestry of judgment and mercy. The fate of Ragnar hung in the balance. A life weighed against honor, duty pitted against survival.
As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light upon the assembly, the verdict was at last reached. Ragnar would live, but exile awaited him. His name would be stripped of its honor in Ravnfjord, and he would be forever cast beyond its borders. Yet his service and courage had spared him the death sentence. Thorvald's expression was a mask of reluctant acceptance, his eyes never leaving Ragnar with a burning intensity. Freya reached out, her hand brushing against Ragnar's arm, a silent acknowledgment of the bond that endured beyond judgment.
Ragnar bowed to the thing, the bitter taste of loss mingling with a strange relief. The path ahead was uncertain, carved in shadows and sacrifice, but it was a path he would walk with unyielding resolve. As the crowd dispersed, the wind carried the distant call of a raven, a solemn reminder that the gods watched still. And though the price of betrayal had been paid in full, the journey toward redemption had only just begun. The cold mountain air pressed heavily against Ragnar's skin as he stood atop the ridge overlooking the sprawling valley below. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the trees, veiling the world in a pale shroud that softened the jagged edges of the wilderness. For a moment the warrior allowed himself to breathe it in, the raw, untamed scent of pine and damp earth, the quiet hum of life moving unseen beneath the canopy. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil roiling within him, a fragile calm on the surface of a storm that had yet to break. Beside him, Ingrid shifted, her small frame wrapped tightly in the wolfskin cloak he had given her months ago. Her eyes, once wide with fear and haunted by shadows, now held a quiet strength. She no longer trembled at the sound of distant wolves, nor flinched when the wind whispered through the branches. Together they had weathered the cruel bite of betrayal, the harsh judgment of kin, and the relentless pursuit of those who sought to extinguish their lives like a flickering flame. Ragnar glanced toward her, the lines of exhaustion etched deep across her pale face, softened by the faintest trace of a smile. It was a smile born not of joy, but of survival, the kind that comes only after the longest night has passed, and the dawn creeps in, uncertain yet undeniable. The girl he had found broken in the woods had become a shield against the darkness, a reason to keep moving when all else threatened to collapse. The journey to this remote sanctuary had been arduous beyond measure. Every step northward into the jagged embrace of the mountains had tested their resolve. Bitter winds tore through ragged clothing, and hungry nights stole what little warmth they could muster from their bones. But with each trial, the bond between them had deepened, a bond forged not in blood, but in shared hardship and fragile hope. Ragnar's thoughts drifted to the path that had led them here. How far removed this moment was from the fevered days when he had stood before Thorvald, stripped of honor, and sent to die on a mission meant to ensure his silence. How far from the stolen nights in the cabin, where Freya's kiss had ignited a fire that now seemed both a blessing and a curse. That fire had burned away much, trust, loyalty, certainty. But it had also laid bare the man beneath the warrior's mask. He shifted his weight, the cold gnawing through leather and flesh, and looked again across the valley. Far below, the faint smoke of distant settlements curled into the sky, reminders that the world beyond these mountains still turned, uncaring of the lives torn apart by ambition and betrayal. A low rustle in the underbrush drew his attention. Ingrid tensed beside him, hand slipping into his. Ragnar squeezed gently, a silent reassurance that they were not alone in this wild place. From the trees emerged a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in worn pelts that bore the marks of many seasons. It was Halvor. His weathered face broke into a rare, genuine smile upon seeing them. "You have come far," Halvor said, his voice rough but warm. "The others did not believe you would survive this long." Ragnar's lips twitched in a faint smirk. "Neither did I." Halvor's gaze flicked to Ingrid, then back to Ragnar. "She is well?" "As well as can be expected," Ragnar replied, his voice soft but firm. "Stronger than when we first found her." Halvor nodded slowly, his eyes shadowed by concern. "News has reached us. Thorvald's grip is loosening. The clans grow restless, and many see the cost of his wrath." Ragnar's jaw tightened. And Freya. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. "Still within Ravnfjord," Halvor answered, "but not for long. The Jarls hold fractures, allies turn uncertain, and even the people whisper of change." Ragnar exhaled, the weight of distance and time pressing down. "Then perhaps the gods have not forsaken us completely." The three stood in silence, the wind carrying the faint call of a raven, a distant echo of the watchful eyes that had shadowed Ragnar since his fall. Days passed in this quiet refuge, marked only by the slow passage of light and the rhythm of survival. Ragnar and Ingrid settled into a fragile routine, their moments of rest punctuated by whispered conversations and cautious plans. Ingrid's health improved steadily. Her cheeks gained a flush of life, and her eyes sparkled with curiosity once more. She spoke little of her past. The scars on her body and soul kept close like treasured secrets. Ragnar dared not pry too deeply. He understood that some wounds healed only in time, not in words. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Ragnar sat beside the fire, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered. Ingrid joined him, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm broth. They shared the silence comfortably, each lost in their own reflections. "You once told me the gods watch for those with no voice," Ingrid said softly, breaking the quiet. Ragnar nodded, the memory clear. "They see more than we give them credit for. They judge not only the deeds, but the heart behind them." She looked up, eyes searching. "Do you believe they have judged you?" A slow smile curved Ragnar's lips, though the shadows in his eyes remained. "Perhaps, but judgment is not always the end. Sometimes it is a beginning." Ingrid's smile was tentative, but genuine. "Then maybe there is hope for both of us." Their bond, forged in fire and hardship, was no longer just a flicker. It was a steady flame, burning bright against the darkness that threatened to consume them. But peace remained elusive. Word of their survival had stirred the currents beyond the mountains. Scouts and spies lurked in the valleys. Whispers of their refuge carried on the wind like poison. The fragile sanctuary was a beacon to those who sought to extinguish it. One cold dawn, as the first light cast long shadows across the frozen ground, the silence shattered. The distant crack of twigs and the low murmur of voices betrayed approaching footsteps. Ragnar's senses snapped sharp. This time they would not hide. He roused Ingrid, urgency sharpening his tone. "They come. Prepare yourself." Together they moved through the shelter, gathering what weapons they had. Ragnar's plain sword and small shield felt inadequate, but it was what fate had offered. The figures emerged from the tree line, men clad in leathers, faces painted with grim determination. At their vanguard stood a familiar silhouette, one that brought a cold knot to Ragnar's stomach. Freya. She rode at the head of the hunting party, her golden hair catching the weak sunlight, eyes blazing with fierce resolve. The woman who had once been love and ruin now bore the armor of a leader, her presence commanding and unyielding. Ragnar's breath caught. The weight of their history hung between them, betrayal and longing, judgment and forgiveness entwined like the roots beneath the soil. Freya dismounted swiftly, her gaze locking on to Ragnar's. No words were spoken, but the air thrummed with unspoken emotions. "I have come not as your enemy," Freya said, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. "The Jarl's grip falters. Our people suffer. We need you, your strength, your wisdom." Ragnar met her eyes, searching for the woman he had known beneath the armor of power and pride. "And what of Thorvald?" She hesitated, a flicker of sorrow crossing her features. "He is lost to his ambition, blinded by vengeance. But there is still a chance to save what remains of Ravnfjord." A silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of all that had passed. Ragnar finally lowered his sword, the gesture a fragile offering. "Then let us forge a new path, not as enemies, but as men and women bound by the will to survive." Freya stepped forward, extending her hand. Together. Ingrid watched quietly from the shadows, a small smile playing on her lips. The threads of past pain began to unravel, woven anew in the tapestry of redemption. As the sun climbed higher, the ragged band of warriors prepared to move, not as hunters and fugitives, but as allies united against the gathering storm. The ravens circled overhead, their black wings cutting arcs against the pale sky, their silent witness to a tale of betrayal, sacrifice, and the fragile hope of forgiveness. Ragnar stood at the forefront, the weight of his scars and sins carried not as chains, but as the hardened armor of a man reborn. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with peril and shadow. Yet for the first time in many moons, the fire within his chest burned not with despair, but with resolve. The gods watched still, and Ragnar Olafsson would answer their silent call, not as a broken man, but as a warrior tempered by fire and bound by honor renewed. The first rays of dawn spilled gently over the reconstructed walls of Ravnfjord, casting long golden fingers across the village that had both weathered storm and betrayal. The air was crisp with the lingering breath of spring, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth and blossoming birch. The once fractured settlement now stirred with a renewed pulse, quiet yet undeniable. From the high ridge overlooking the fjord, Ragnar Olafsson stood watching. His silhouette, framed by the soft light, bore the weight of scars and stories, but his eyes held a quiet steadiness, the kind born of hard-won peace. It had been months since the last clash, since the smoke of war had settled, and the dust of betrayal had finally begun to clear. The bitterness that once hung like a shadow over Ravnfjord had begun to dissolve, replaced by something far more fragile and far more precious. Forgiveness, understanding, the slow weaving of trust where once only suspicion had dwelled. Ragnar's gaze swept over the village, smoke curling from chimneys, children darting between timber-framed homes, men and women working side by side in the fields and workshops. The Thing Circle, once a place of harsh judgment, now echoed with laughter and debate, the voices of clansfolk eager to rebuild not only walls, but ties that had been torn apart. At his side stood Ingrid, now grown stronger and steadier, her hands calloused from tending fields and gathering herbs.
The girl from the wild woods had found a home here, not by blood, but by the bonds forged in survival and respect. She looked up at Ragnar, her green eyes bright with quiet pride. "You have done more than survive," she said softly. "You have helped us all find a way forward." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "We carry our past like armor, but it need not weigh us down forever." Their path had not been an easy one. Exile had once seemed an unbreakable sentence, a line drawn in the cold earth separating what was from what could never be again. Yet here, in the thaw of spring, that line blurred. The very people who once condemned him had come to see the man beneath the label of traitor, the warrior who chose life not for selfish gain, but to protect what remained. The memory of Freya lingered in Ragnar's mind like a distant flame, a warmth tempered by loss and longing. She had returned to Ravnfjord as well, no longer the woman cloaked in pride and secrets, but as a force for healing, her voice a steady current guiding her people toward unity.
Despite the pain that their shared past held, she and Ragnar had found a tentative peace, a silent accord acknowledging the cost of choices made in desperation. From the village, the sound of the hammer striking anvil rang sharp and steady, a reminder of the work still to be done. New weapons were forged, not for war, but for protection. New tools crafted to till the stubborn soil. The old ways evolved gently, the traditions of blood and battle tempered by the lessons carved into the hearts of those who survived. Halvor came forward, his broad frame a familiar and reassuring presence. Battle-hardened and loyal, he had stood by Ragnar through the darkest hours, and now walked beside him into this uncertain dawn. "You have transformed more than yourself," Halvor said, voice low but steady. "The clan remembers not only the betrayal, but the courage to rise above it." Ragnar's eyes met his friend's, the silent weight of shared history passing between them. "And the gods watch still," he murmured. "Odin's ravens have flown far, but they have not forgotten." A sudden flutter caught their attention, a lone black bird, a raven, descending gracefully onto a weathered branch nearby. Its dark eyes seemed to bore through the veil of time, watching, waiting. Neither man spoke. The raven was not simply a bird, it was a symbol, a silent witness to the cycle of ruin and renewal. In the days that followed, the village gathered beneath the wide sky for a new thing, one not born of judgment, but of hope. The circle was filled with voices, old and young, warrior and healer, leader and commoner, all bound by the desire to rebuild what had been broken. Ragnar stepped forward, not as a lord or a warrior, but as a man, humbled by the journey. His words were few, but carried the weight of truth. "We all bear the scars of our choices," he said quietly. "But it is not the scar that defines us, but what we build beyond it." The assembly nodded, the murmurs of agreement rising like the tide. Freya stood nearby, her eyes shining with unshed tears and unspoken forgiveness. She reached out, her hand steady, and Ragnar took it. A gesture not of rekindled love, but of shared respect and the fragile threads of reconciliation. Children played at their feet, weaving through legs and laughter, the promise of future seasons echoing in their joyous cries. The old gods would watch, the ravens would fly, but the living would shape the legacy. Ragnar understood then that his exile had not been an end, but a transformation. The path he walked was no longer one of solitary survival, but of belonging, an acceptance earned in fire and shadow. The village of Ravnfjord, battered but unbroken, breathed anew beneath the vast northern sky. The seasons would turn, as they always had, carrying with them stories of betrayal and redemption, of loss and hope.
And through it all, the silent watchers, the ravens, would glide across the wind, bearing witness to the eternal dance between darkness and light.
As the sun dipped low, casting a fiery glow over the fjord's shimmering waters, Ragnar Olafsson stood among his people, not as a traitor, nor a fallen warrior, but as a man reborn. The price of betrayal had carved deep wounds, but from those wounds had grown the roots of a new life. And in the quiet stillness, beneath the watchful eyes of Odin's corvids, that life began, not with the clamor of swords, but with the slow, steady heartbeat of a village healing, and a warrior finally at peace. The sun dipped below the horizon, bleeding molten gold into the darkening sky, as the village of Ravnfjord settled into the quiet embrace of evening. Shadows stretched long across the fields and timbered homes, softening the edges of a world that had been reshaped by fire, blood, and the unyielding will to endure. Ragnar stood alone at the water's edge, the cold fjord lapping gently at his boots, the salt and chill a reminder of the relentless land he had once called home, and the new one he had yet to fully claim. The raven's call echoed faintly in the distance, a haunting sound carried on the wind, like an ancient whisper threading through the twilight. For a long moment, Ragnar watched the blackbird as it glided effortlessly over the waters, wings outstretched against the fading light. It was the same raven, or so it seemed, that had perched silently outside the cabin on that fateful night, bearing witness to every moment of betrayal and anguish. But now its presence felt different, less a judge, more a guide. He allowed himself to breathe deeply, the sharp, bracing air filling his lungs. The weight that had pressed upon him for so long, the burden of broken oaths, fractured loyalty, and the sting of exile, had begun to ease. Not because the past was forgotten, but because it had become the foundation for something new. Something forged not in the blind heat of passion, or the cold steel of vengeance, but in the quiet resolve to live beyond the shadows of sin. Ragnar's gaze drifted upward, to the first stars pricking the velvet sky. The constellations were the same ones his ancestors had tracked across endless northern nights. They were constant, enduring, silent witnesses to the cycles of life, death, and the ceaseless dance of fate. He remembered the faces that had shaped his journey, Freya, her emerald eyes fierce with love and regret; Thorvald, whose wrath had been as unyielding as the sea; Halvor, the brother who had stood steadfast through storms both external and internal; and Ingrid, the fragile flame that had kindled hope in the darkest of woods. Each had been a thread woven into the tapestry of his existence, each a testament to the complexity of loyalty and the price exacted by choices made in desperation. As the night deepened, the village behind him settled into rest. The low murmur of voices, the scrape of tools laid aside, the soft breathing of children, all these sounds mingled with the natural chorus of the northern wilds. It was a symphony of life continuing, of wounds healing, and of futures yet to be written. Ragnar's hand brushed over the worn leather grip of his simple sword, a weapon stripped of glory, but still heavy with meaning. It was a reminder that honor is not found solely in victory or in the approval of others, but in the courage to face oneself, to embrace the consequences of one's actions, and to seek a path forward even when the way is shrouded in doubt. He looked down at his forearm, tracing the faded runes inked long ago, symbols of protection and strength. They had carried him through battles and betrayals alike. Now they seemed to pulse with a quieter power, the whispered promise of redemption. The raven's call came again, closer this time, before the bird settled on a nearby branch.
Its dark eyes met Ragnar's, and in that silent exchange he felt an unspoken message threading through the ancient bond between man and God. The gods watch. They judge not only deeds, but hearts. And sometimes they offer mercy through the very hands that have been stained. Ragnar allowed a small, weary smile to grace his lips. The journey had been long, and the cost steep. But beneath the scars and the shadows there remained a flicker, a spark that refused to be extinguished. He turned away from the fjord, stepping back toward the village that was no longer just a place of exile or betrayal, but a home reborn from ashes. The footsteps he left in the soft earth were steady now, sure, carrying the weight of a man who had known loss and found a way to stand again. In the deep northern night, the ravens circled overhead, their flight a silent testament to the endurance of those who walk the knife's edge between darkness and light. And as their wings beat against the cold air, the whispered legacy of the warrior carried on, an eternal story of love, honor, betrayal, and the relentless hope for redemption. If you have journeyed with Ragnar Olafsson through the shadows and storms, then you understand that the true battle is not always fought with sword and shield, but within the heart. The choices we make, the paths we take, each carries a price, and each offers the chance to redefine who we are beyond the scars we bear. Thank you for walking this path with us. If the winds of these ancient tales stir something within you, consider joining our growing fellowship. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and help keep the flame of history alive. Together, we will explore more stories carved in ice and blood, where the gods watch silently and the human soul is tested beyond measure. Until the next tale unfolds beneath the northern skies, remember this. Sometimes the weight of betrayal becomes the forge where honor is reborn. And in that fire, even the darkest night can give way to dawn.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.